Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Oklahoma Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1871 brought more than just bitter cold to the recently established Oklahoma Territory, a territory caught between the unforgiving wilderness and the relentless march of civilization. A place where law was more theory than practice, where distance meant isolation, and where some secrets remained buried beneath frozen soil for generations. Near the banks of the Canadian River, 20 miles from any settlement worth naming, stood the Blackwood Ranch, not the largest in the territory, but certainly the most self-sufficient. A sprawling property of nearly 800 acres, marked by rolling hills, small stands of timber, and fields that promised prosperity to anyone willing to extract it from the unforgiving soil. The main house, constructed of locally quarried limestone and rough-hewn timber, stood 2 stories tall, an unusual sight of permanence in a land where most structures seemed temporary and reluctant. County records from 1868 show that the property was purchased by one Elias Blackwood, aged 42, formerly of Missouri. A widower, according to what little paperwork existed, though no death certificate for Mrs. Blackwood was ever filed in any county across 3 states, as a researcher from the University of Oklahoma would note in an unpublished thesis dated 1964. The purchase was completed with gold coin rather than banknotes or credit, a detail that raised no eyebrows at the time, but would later be considered significant by those few who studied the case. Blackwood was known in the sparse trading posts and settlements as a man of few words but considerable means. He employed 4 ranch hands, all men with questionable pasts and little interest in conversation. According to the bartender at Conway station, who was interviewed for a territorial history project in 1952 but requested his name be withheld, Blackwood's employees weren't the sort of men who made eye contact during conversation. Each had a look about him like he was perpetually calculating something unpleasant. The ranch operated largely on its own, raising cattle and keeping an unusually large number of pigs, which Blackwood claimed provided a steady secondary income. The territorial tax assessor's records from 1870 noted the unusual size of the swine operation, nearly 60 animals at full capacity, far more than most ranchers maintained in that region. When questioned about this by the assessor, Blackwood reportedly stated that pork travels better than beef, and that he had arrangements with mining operations westward. What brought attention to the Blackwood Ranch wasn't what happened there, but rather what stopped happening around it. Between the summer of 1869 and the winter of 1871, reports of bandit activity along the southern routes into the territory dropped by nearly 60%, a curious development as noted in dispatches from the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The reduction wasn't attributed to increased law enforcement presence. If anything, the territory remained woefully underpoliced. The first documented connection between these facts came from a letter written by Deputy Marshal James Harrington, dated December 18, 1870. In correspondences to his superior in Fort Smith, Harrington noted, "The curious case of the Vanishing Outlaws continues to perplex. 3 separate gangs known to operate between the Red River and Canadian have seemingly dissolved into the air. Local wisdom suggests they've moved westward toward more promising grounds, though no reports from those territories confirm such migration." In the same correspondence, Harrington made his first mention of Blackwood. A local rancher named Blackwood has offered the theory that the harsher-than-usual winter has driven the criminal element toward more hospitable climates. An interesting perspective from a man who so rarely engages with official channels. I find myself wondering about his sudden interest in outlaw movements. The Territorial Governor's Quarterly Report, filed in January 1871, included a brief section on criminal activity that noted the unusual decrease, but attributed it to natural fluctuations in frontier conditions. This report would later be cited by the Oklahoma Historical Society as evidence of either remarkable naivety or deliberate blindness on the part of territorial officials. What history remembers, or perhaps more accurately, what history forgot until an archivist discovered a collection of weather-damaged journals in 1952, begins with the arrival of a man calling himself Thomas Reeves at the Blackwood Ranch on January 4th, 1871. According to what can be pieced together from both Reeves' journal and subsequent territorial records, he was not seeking employment or shelter, but his brother. Reeves's journal, portions of which were transcribed before the original was lost during the relocation of the Oklahoma Historical Society's archives in 1961, described his arrival. Reached the Blackwood property near sundown, a forbidding place despite its evident prosperity. The main house stands apart from 3 outbuildings, all well constructed, but somehow unwelcoming. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, yet no one responded to my calls until I had knocked for nearly 5 minutes. When I inquired about Michael, he denied knowing anyone by that name, despite my showing the letter with this very address penned in my brother's hand. What Reeves didn't mention in that first entry, but would later detail, was that Michael had written to him 3 months prior, describing his employment at a prosperous ranch near the Canadian River, owned by a man named Blackwood. The letter, which Reeves kept folded in his Bible, noted that the pay was exceptional, the work manageable, and that Michael intended to stay through the winter before heading to California. The owner, a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered leather, answered with a shotgun across his arms. It was the last correspondence the family received. The territorial census taker who visited the region in late 1870 recorded 4 male employees at the Blackwood Ranch, none named Michael Reeves. This discrepancy wouldn't have been notable, as record-keeping in the territory was inconsistent at best, except for what Thomas Reeves noticed during his unwelcome visit. As documented in his journal, while Blackwood denied knowledge of Michael, I observed 5 dinner plates on the kitchen table behind him. When I mentioned this, his demeanor changed entirely. The door closed in my face with a warning that trespassers would be shot without question, as was the custom in these parts. Reeves further noted, as I mounted my horse to leave, I felt watched from every window of that stone house. Though I saw no faces, the sensation of being observed was unmistakable. Most curious was the silence. A property of that size, with livestock and multiple residents, should never be so still. The journal entry concludes with an observation that would later prove significant. At the edge of the property, near where the access road meets the main trail, I noticed what appeared to be a fresh gravesite, earth recently turned, though no marker was present. When I circled back for a closer look, a ranch hand appeared as if from nowhere, rifle in hand, to inquire about my interest. I claimed to have dropped my tobacco pouch. He watched without blinking until I rode away. Reeves took lodging at Conway Station, a small trading post and way station some 15 miles from the Blackwood Ranch. There he began asking questions. The station keeper, William Conway, initially seemed reluctant to discuss Blackwood at all. According to Reeves's journal, Conway's face tightened at the mere mention of the man. Folks who mind their business tend to live longer in these parts, he told me, though his eyes kept drifting toward a table of freight haulers who had suddenly gone quiet. Conway Station, as documented in territorial commercial records, served as the primary supply point and mail depot for a 30-mile radius. The building itself was a substantial log structure with a stone foundation, containing a general store, a small dining area, 6 rental rooms, and stables for up to 20 horses. The 1870 business directory listed Conway as proprietor, postmaster, and notary, suggesting a man of some education and standing. It wasn't until Reeves had spent 3 days at the station that one of the regular traders, a man identified only as Hollister in the journal, approached him after several whiskeys. According to Reeves' account, Hollister spoke in hushed tones, glancing repeatedly at the door. "Your brother wasn't the first to disappear out at Blackwood's place," he said. "There have been others, men who signed on for work and were never seen again. Blackwood claims they moved on, took their pay, and headed west, but some never collected their belongings from Conway's safekeeping." Reeves recorded Hollister's further comments. "He told me Blackwood arrived in the territory with more money than explanation, built his operation too quickly for honest work. The locals noted his habit of employing men passing through, often those traveling alone or seeming desperate for work. Curiously, these temporary hands rarely lasted more than a month or two before Blackwood reported they'd moved on. Only the core group, 4 men Hollister described as having the look of men who've killed for reasons other than necessity, remained constant. This conversation appears to have been the catalyst for Reeves' decision to investigate further, rather than seeking official assistance. The nearest U.S. outpost, Marshall, was stationed over 100 miles away, and, as Reeves noted, in this territory, a man must often be his own law. The journal entry for January 8th indicates Reeves's methodical approach. Purchased a quality field glass from Conway Supplies. The German-made optic cost nearly a week's wages, but will allow observation from distance. Also acquired a map of the region with Blackwood's property boundaries marked according to Conway's knowledge. The man seemed reluctant to assist, but was persuaded by both coin and my explanation of brotherly duty. What followed was a methodical investigation conducted by a man with no formal training, but driven by brotherly concern. Reeves began tracking the movements to and from the Blackwood Ranch. His journal from January 9, 1871 notes, "Positioned myself on the ridge overlooking the main approach to Blackwood's. Through my field glass, I observed normal ranch operations throughout the morning. Cattle being moved between pastures, a wagon returning from what I presume was Conway's station with supplies. Most curious was the afternoon activity at the far pig enclosures. 2 men spent considerable time there, though no feed wagon was brought. They appeared to be digging." The next day's entry expands on this observation. "Relocated to the western approach, allowing view of the rear of the property where the pig enclosures are situated. The animals are kept in a series of connected pens, far more elaborate than necessary for simple livestock. The ground around these enclosures has been cleared of vegetation for 20 yards in all directions, creating what appears to be a deliberate perimeter. The pigs themselves are enormous creatures, larger than any I've seen in Missouri or elsewhere in the territory. Their feeding regimen appears unusual. They receive attention only once daily near dusk." 2 days later, Reeves documented a significant arrival. A group of 3 men on horseback arrived near dusk, rough-looking sorts with the unmistakable bearing of outlaws. They were admitted to the main house after a brief exchange with Blackwood himself, who met them in the yard. Their horses were taken to the stable by one of the hands. The men did not emerge from the house before nightfall forced me to abandon my position. The following morning, January 12th, Reeves noted, "Returned before dawn, no sign of the visitors' horses in the corral. The property appears unusually quiet." The entry continues with a disturbing observation. At approximately 9 o'clock, observed significant activity at the rear of the property. A wagon was brought around to the back entrance of the main house. Something large was loaded onto it, covered with tarpaulin. The wagon then proceeded to the far end of the property, where the pig enclosures are located. 2 men accompanied it on horseback, rifles clearly visible across their saddles. What happened over the next 3 days remains partially lost to history, as several pages from Reeves's journal were damaged beyond legibility before their discovery. What can be determined resumes on January 16th with a hurried entry. "My suspicions confirmed in the worst possible manner. Observed from the North Ridge. The 3 visitors were taken to the barn shortly after sunrise, separately at approximately 1-hour intervals. None returned to the house. By midday, their horses had been redistributed among the property's existing stock, identifying markings altered with hot iron." The entry continues with increasing agitation evident in the handwriting. "The first man was taken with no sign of struggle. I presume he suspected nothing. The second appeared to resist briefly but was subdued by multiple ranch hands. The third must have heard something amiss as he attempted to flee on foot across the eastern pasture. They pursued on horseback. The distance was too great for me to see clearly, but he did not escape. The most disturbing entry follows on January 17th. The pig enclosures, dear God. The sounds. They don't simply keep those animals, they use them. The entry continues after a gap, the handwriting now steadier, as if Reeves had composed himself. I now understand the purpose of the elaborate pen system. The design allows for controlling which animals have access to what is placed before them. The efficiency is horrifying. Nothing remains, nothing that would identify, that would prove. Reeves apparently left his observation post that same day and returned to Conway Station, where he attempted to persuade several men to accompany him to confront Blackwood. According to the station ledger, discovered during a 1955 renovation of the building, which by then had become a general store, Reeves purchased ammunition, additional provisions, and paid his outstanding room bill on January 18th. A notation in Conway's handwriting indicates, "Advised against his course of action. Man seems determined to his own destruction." The ledger also records that Reeves attempted to send a telegram to the Territorial Marshal's office in Fort Smith. Conway's notes indicate the message was accepted for transmission, though no record of its receipt exists in preserved Fort Smith communications. Whether the message was ever sent remains a matter of speculation among the few historians familiar with the case. A partial letter from Conway to his brother-in-law, dated January 18, 1871, provides additional context. The Reeves fellow has caused considerable disquiet with his questions and observations. Word has undoubtedly reached Blackwood through channels I cannot control. I fear we may soon face unpleasantness. I have advised the man to depart the territory forthwith, but he speaks of justice and brotherhood with the fervor of one who cannot be dissuaded. Some men cannot be protected from their own righteousness. Territorial records contain no official report of what happened next. No investigation was launched, no formal complaints filed. What we know comes from scattered sources assembled decades later. A weather damage page from Reeves's journal, his last entry, dated January 19, 1871. Returning to Blackwoods alone. Conway claims no man will accompany me, stating, "There are some affairs best left undisturbed in these parts. I cannot abandon Michael to whatever fate has befallen him. I will approach directly this time." The Colt provides some confidence, though I harbor few illusions about my chances against multiple experienced gunmen. The final paragraph partially illegible due to water damage. Should this journal be found after my disappearance, let it serve as testimony to what occurs at the Blackwood Ranch. My suspicions are now certainties. The reduction in bandit activity is no coincidence. Blackwood has established an arrangement with certain criminal elements to illegible section. The disposal of bodies through his livestock operation. The territorial officials must be informed, regardless of the personal cost. I have hidden copies of my earlier notes beneath the loose floorboard in my room at Conway's. May God grant me courage for what must be done. The journal ends there. No further writings from Thomas Reeves have ever been discovered. The next documented reference to the Blackwood Ranch comes from the quarterly report of Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the territory's circuit-riding physician, dated March 1871. Called to attend Elias Blackwood for a severe gunshot wound to the shoulder. Patient claimed the injury resulted from a weapon discharge while clearing a misfire. The wound characteristics suggest otherwise, appearing more consistent with a defensive injury. Patient refused further questioning on the matter, noted unusual atmosphere among the ranch hands. All appeared exceedingly watchful. Dr. Wilson's personal daybook, discovered among his effects after his death in 1899 and later donated to the Oklahoma Medical Historical Society, contains a more detailed and candid assessment. Blackwood's wound was almost certainly from a revolver at close range. Powder burns on surrounding fabric confirm this. The angle suggests he was facing his assailant. When I inquired about the whereabouts of this assailant, the ranch foreman interrupted to state that accidents happen alone. I have never felt more unwelcome at a patient's bedside, nor more concerned for my own safety while practicing medicine. A partial letter discovered in 1959 among the personal effects of William Conway provides another piece of the puzzle. Dated February 3, 1871, addressed to his sister in Tennessee. Business continues steadily, though we've had some disruption following the disappearance of a visitor who had been asking unwelcome questions. The man, Reeves by name, departed suddenly after purchasing supplies, stating his intention to confront Blackwood over some perceived offense. He has not returned, nor has anyone reported seeing him on the trails. Such disappearances are not uncommon in the territory, though this one has left an uneasy feeling among the regular travelers. The letter continues, "I find myself contemplating a change of scenery, perhaps Colorado or even further west. The station provides a comfortable living, but recent events have cast a pall over daily operations. One cannot help but wonder what other disappearances might follow, particularly of those who ask questions better left unasked." Conway's business ledger shows a curious pattern in the weeks following Reeves's disappearance. Trade with the Blackwood Ranch increased significantly, with larger-than-usual purchases of grain, salt, and other provisions. More telling is an entry dated February 12, 1871. Special order for Blackwood, 6 casks lime, 40-pound salt, iron tools, 3, as specified. Premium paid for discretion. The most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source. In early March 1871, a severe storm caused significant flooding along the Canadian River. A portion of the riverbank near the Blackwood property collapsed, exposing what was initially thought to be a natural cave. A report filed by a land surveyor, cataloging flood damage for insurance purposes, contains this brief notation: exposed cavity approximately 30 yards from river's normal edge revealed significant accumulation of human remains. Initial observation suggests multiple individuals. Matter referred to territorial authorities. The surveyor, one Nathan Hargrove, later provided a voluntary statement to a U.S. Marshal preserved in federal archives and discovered during a 1958 research project on frontier law enforcement. I initially believed I had discovered an Indian burial site, which are not uncommon along the river. Closer inspection revealed these remains were not arranged in any ceremonial manner, but rather disposed of haphazardly. Most disturbing was their condition. Many appeared to have been partially processed in some manner I hesitate to describe. Some bones showed evidence of saw marks or other deliberate segmentation. I departed immediately to report the discovery. What followed this discovery is documented in fragmentary fashion through telegraph communications between territorial officials and federal authorities. An initial investigation was apparently launched with a U.S. Marshal and 2 deputies dispatched from Fort Smith. Their preliminary report, dated March 20th of 1871, noted, "Site examination confirms human remains of at least 7 individuals, possibly more. Evidence suggests deliberate disposal rather than natural accumulation. Proceeding to Blackwood Ranch to make inquiries." No follow-up report was ever filed. A telegraph dated March 25th from the Territorial Governor's Office to Washington, D.C., referenced regrettable incident involving federal officers and requested additional personnel. Before such personnel could be dispatched, a final communication, dated March 30th, indicated the matter had been resolved locally, and no further federal presence was required. A partially preserved memorandum from the Office of the Territorial Governor, discovered during archival research in 1962, provides the only official explanation. Incident at Canadian River resolved through local militia action. Perpetrator in custody. Property secured. Matter to be handled through judicial channels without further federal involvement to avoid unnecessary public alarm. Land records show that ownership of the Blackwood Ranch transferred on April 12, 1871, to the territorial government under unusual circumstances. No sale price was recorded, and the property remained unoccupied for nearly 2 years afterward. Local newspaper accounts make no mention of Elias Blackwood's fate, though a single entry in the Territorial Prison Register, discovered during a 1963 academic study of frontier justice, lists an E. Blackwood as having been transferred to a federal facility in Illinois in late April 1871. No record of his arrival exists in surviving Illinois prison documentation. The fate of Blackwood's employees remains similarly unclear. No arrest records exist for any individuals associated with the ranch. Local lore, as recorded in several oral history projects conducted in the early 20th century, suggests that at least 2 men were hanged by a hastily formed posse, though no official documentation confirms this. A third reportedly fled the territory entirely, while the fourth provided information to authorities in exchange for leniency. Again, no formal records substantiate these claims. The most intriguing piece of evidence emerged in 1952, when a local historian named Margaret Thorpe interviewed elderly residents of the area for an oral history project. One participant, identified as Jefferson Williams, claimed to have worked briefly at Conway Station as a young man in 1871. According to the transcript, nobody much talked about what happened out at Blackwood's place, not directly, but everybody knew. Man had a way of making problems disappear, travelers mostly. Folks passing through who nobody would miss. Word was he'd offer good pay for short work, get them out to that isolated place. Then they'd vanish. Some said he had an arrangement with certain bandit gangs, too. They'd bring him people who'd seen too much or who had prices on their heads that were too small to bother collecting officially. Blackwood would pay them something for their trouble. Then those brought in would disappear too eventually. When pressed about what happened to these individuals, Williams reportedly lowered his voice. The pigs, that's what they said. Blackwood kept more hogs than any operation needed, kept them hungry too. The way I heard it, there wasn't much left to bury afterward. Williams further elaborated on the business model. Blackwood wasn't just disposing of bodies, he was creating them for profit. Outlaws would bring him people they'd captured, rivals, witnesses, anyone they needed gone. He'd handle the matter completely, no questions asked. The story was that he charged based on how much trouble the person might cause. Ordinary drifters were cheap, lawmen cost more. Williams's account might be dismissed as frontier sensationalism, except for one detail that corresponds with physical evidence. The archaeological survey of the Blackwood property, conducted in 1959 as part of a reservoir planning project, noted unusually high concentrations of bone fragments in the soil surrounding the former pig enclosures. The report characterized these as consistent with typical slaughter waste, though no comparative analysis was conducted to determine species origin. The report also documented an unusual structure foundation near the pig enclosures. Approximately 20 yards from the primary animal pens, we discovered the foundation of what appears to have been a small but substantial building, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet. The foundation depth and construction suggest a structure designed for security rather than storage or animal husbandry. Most unusual was the discovery of iron rings embedded in the remaining floor, positioned in a manner suggesting restraint purposes rather than animal handling. Conway's station ledgers from 1869 to 1870 contain numerous entries for supplies delivered to the Blackwood Ranch that, while not incriminating individually, create a disturbing pattern when viewed collectively. Large quantities of quicklime, usually used for sanitation or masking odors. Unusual amounts of salt, far beyond typical meat preservation needs. Heavy chains and specialized tools with no obvious agricultural purpose. Special orders for acid compounds typically used in tanning or metalwork, despite no evidence of such activities at the ranch. A particularly telling entry from November 1870 notes, "Special order filled for E. Blackwood, imported English rasps and saws, surgical quality, from St. Louis." Note: client specified these were for processing game. The federal investigation that followed the discovery of remains near the Blackwood property was uncharacteristically brief and poorly documented. What little can be pieced together suggests that the U.S. Marshal and deputies who initially responded met with resistance. A telegraph from the Marshal to Fort Smith headquarters, dated March 22, 1871, requested immediate reinforcement due to armed opposition to lawful investigation. No record exists of what transpired next, though a burial registry from the Territorial Cemetery in Oklahoma City contains an entry dated April 2, 1871. Marshal J. Harrington and Deputy W. Taylor killed in line of duty. No details of the circumstances are provided. An internal memorandum from the Department of Justice to the Territorial Governor's Office, dated April 4, 1871, makes oblique reference to the incident. In light of recent events in the Canadian River jurisdiction and the regrettable loss of federal personnel, the department recommends discretion in all public communications regarding the matter. Local resolution of remaining issues is advised to prevent undue public concern regarding territorial governance effectiveness. This apparent federal retreat from the case coincides with the only known newspaper reference to the events, a small item in the Oklahoma City Sentinel dated April 6, 1871. Reports of disturbances along the Canadian River have been greatly exaggerated, according to territorial officials. Citizens are assured that all criminal elements have been addressed, and no ongoing threat to public safety exists. The story of Elias Blackwood and his ranch faded from local memory as the territory transformed into statehood, and the Canadian River Valley changed with settlement and development. The property itself was eventually submerged when the McGee Creek Reservoir was completed in 1966, burying whatever secrets might have remained beneath 40 feet of water. What can be definitively concluded from the fragmentary evidence? Only that during a brief period in the early 1870s, people disappeared in the vicinity of a remote Oklahoma ranch. The exact number remains unknown. No formal charges were ever documented against Elias Blackwood in surviving records. The remains discovered in the riverbank collapse were never officially identified, and according to a notation in territorial records, were reinterred in an unmarked section of the Fort Smith Cemetery in April 1871. The fate of Thomas Reeves was never determined with certainty. No body matching his description was among those recovered from the riverbank. His journal, recovered decades later under circumstances that remain unclear, ends abruptly before his final confrontation with Blackwood. Some researchers suggest he may have been responsible for Blackwood's gunshot wound before meeting his own end, while others propose he might have escaped, perhaps abandoning his quest after discovering its dangers. A tantalizing clue emerged in 1963 when a researcher examining California voter registration records from the 1880s discovered an entry for a Thomas Reeves in Mendocino County, listed as formerly of Missouri. The occupation given was journalist, and the date of residence establishment was noted as 1872. Whether this was the same Thomas Reeves cannot be confirmed, though the coincidence is striking. Reeves, titled Frontiers of Darkness, Territories Without Law. While never mentioning Blackwood or Oklahoma Territory by name, the articles describe a ranch where men were processed like livestock, and territorial officials who buried horror rather than confronting it. The series was discontinued after 3 installments, with the publisher's note citing the author's declining health. As for Michael Reeves, the brother whose disappearance initiated these events, no trace was ever found. Even more intriguing is a series of articles published in a small California newspaper in 1886, authored by a T. His name appears in no territorial records, no cemetery registries, no prison logs. Like many who vanished on the frontier, he simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. The employees of the Blackwood Ranch similarly vanished from historical record. No subsequent census lists any of the men identified as working there. No pension records, land claims, or marriage certificates bear their names in Oklahoma Territory or surrounding states. It is as if they, like their employers' activities, were systematically erased from official memory. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case is how efficiently it was erased from public consciousness. No newspaper accounts detail the investigation or its resolution. No trial records exist. The territorial government's apparent haste to take possession of the property and then leave it vacant suggests a desire to literally bury a story too grim for public consumption. William Conway, whose station provided the only consistent connection between the Blackwood Ranch and the outside world, sold his business in late 1871 and relocated to Colorado. His correspondence in subsequent years makes no mention of Blackwood or the events along the Canadian River. A letter to his former assistant, dated 1875, contains only a cryptic reference. "I trust the station prospers under new management, and that the difficulties of that final winter have faded from local memory. Some businesses are better conducted without certain clientele, regardless of their spending habits." In 1964, historian Robert Chambers attempted to publish a comprehensive account of the Blackwood case as part of a broader study of frontier justice. According to colleagues, his manuscript was completed and submitted to the University of Oklahoma Press, but was rejected without explanation. Chambers' research notes, which might have contained additional information, were reportedly lost during an office fire at the university in 1965. Chambers himself accepted a position at an East Coast university shortly thereafter and never returned to the subject. A letter from Chambers to a colleague, preserved in the recipient's personal papers and discovered during an estate liquidation in 1978, suggests the historian encountered resistance beyond simple editorial decisions. The difficulty appears not to be the quality of research or writing, but rather the subject itself. Certain influential parties within the state historical establishment express concern that publishing such material would reflect poorly on territorial governance and unnecessarily darken the state's founding narrative. One reviewer went so far as to suggest that some histories, regardless of documentation, serve no constructive purpose. I find myself in the peculiar position of having proven something that no one wishes proven. The waters of McGee Creek Reservoir now cover the former Blackwood Ranch. Occasional fishermen drift above what was once the main house, the outbuildings, the pig enclosures. Few, if any, know what may have occurred beneath their boats. The land keeps its secrets, as it has for generations. Those seeking definitive answers in the Blackwood case will be disappointed. Like many frontier incidents, it exists more in negative space, in what records don't say, in abrupt endings, in curious silences, than in documented fact. What can be said with some certainty is that for a brief period, the territorial bend of the Canadian River may have concealed horrors more disturbing than any typical frontier violence. The archaeological survey conducted before the reservoir's creation provided one final disturbing piece of evidence. Near what had been the main house foundation, excavation revealed a hidden cellar room not indicated in any surviving property records. The space, approximately 12 feet square, contained a drain system leading to the nearby river. The walls, according to the survey report, retained staining consistent with prolonged blood exposure, despite the passage of nearly a century. Most telling were the tools discovered within, specialized implements that the report's author, with clinical detachment, described as designed for the systematic dismemberment of large mammals. The survey team's photographs and artifacts were cataloged and stored in the State Historical Society's archives. A notation in the accession records, dated 1967, indicates the collection was removed for further analysis. No record of its return exists. Inquiries by subsequent researchers have been met with confusion or referrals to departments that disclaim knowledge of the materials. The last known reference to the case appears in the private correspondence of William Conway, who sold his station and relocated to Colorado in 1872. In a letter to a former business associate, dated June 1873, he wrote, I find the mountain air agrees with me considerably better than the atmosphere of the territory. Some places carry burdens too heavy for decent men to bear silently. I sleep more soundly now, without certain sounds carrying across the prairie at night. The letter continues with a passage that historians have found particularly telling. I sometimes wonder what became of young Reeves, the one who asked so many questions. His determination was admirable, if ultimately foolish. Had he come even a year earlier, he might have departed with nothing more than disappointment. But by the time of his arrival, the operation had grown too extensive, too profitable to allow disruption. The territorial margins attract two kinds of men, those seeking escape from civilization's constraints and those willing to profit from such seekers. Blackwood merely found the intersection of these ambitions and exploited it with unusual efficiency. Conway concludes with what might be the most candid assessment of the Blackwood operation from anyone with direct knowledge. What troubles me most is not the depravity of one man, but the complicity of so many. The traders who asked no questions when delivering unusual supplies. The local officials who ignored reports of disappearances. The bandit gangs who found in Blackwood a convenient solution to their problems. Even I, maintaining neutrality while suspecting the worst. We built something monstrous through our collective silence. Perhaps the territory itself demands such compromise, but I find I can no longer make peace with it. As for the pigs that once populated the Blackwood Ranch, territorial records indicate they were slaughtered and buried shortly after the property's transfer to government ownership. No reason was recorded for this action, though the expense was noted as necessary for public health considerations. A curious addendum to the directive ordering their destruction specifies that the burial pits were to be treated with quicklime and located no less than 10 feet deep, unusual precautions for routine livestock disposal. Local stories collected by folklore researchers in the early 20th century suggest that the slaughter team refused to process the meat for consumption. According to one account, attributed to the son of a man who participated, Pa said those animals weren't natural anymore, said they'd developed a taste that changed them somehow. The way they looked at men wasn't like regular stock. Pa wouldn't eat pork for the rest of his days after what he saw out there. Perhaps there are some hungers that, once fed, leave permanent stains on the land. Perhaps there are some appetites that, once witnessed, cannot be forgotten, even by those who only heard the distant echoes. Today, the story of Elias Blackwood exists primarily as a footnote in obscure academic texts, occasionally referenced in studies of frontier justice anomalies or territorial governance. The land where it happened has been transformed, the physical evidence submerged, the witnesses long dead. All that remains are fragments of documentation, preserved through chance and scattered across archives rarely accessed. And yet, something persists. Local fishing guides occasionally report that certain areas of McGee Creek Reservoir remain strangely devoid of fish, despite ideal conditions. Some claim that on particularly still nights, when the water lies flat as glass under the moon, sounds carry across the surface. Sounds that some insist resemble distant squealing, though most attribute this to wild hogs in the surrounding hills. A final curious epilogue to the Blackwood case emerged in 1969, when construction workers expanding a road near the reservoir uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The box, severely corroded but intact, contained a leather wallet, a pocket watch, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, though water-damaged, was partially legible and appeared to be a handwritten note. According to the county sheriff's report, the note read, "If found, please forward to Sarah Reeves of Springfield, Missouri. Tell her Michael was not the only one. The truth lies beneath black." The remainder was illegible. The sheriff's investigation determined that the artifacts likely belonged to Thomas Reeves, based on initials engraved on the watch. Attempts to locate any descendants of Sarah Reeves in Springfield proved unsuccessful. The items were eventually transferred to the State Historical Society, where they were cataloged and placed in storage. A request to examine them in 1978 by a graduate student researching frontier disappearances received the response that the items had been misplaced during reorganization. The location where the box was discovered corresponds roughly to what would have been the eastern boundary of the Blackwood property, near where Reeves reported seeing what he believed to be a fresh grave in January 1871. Whether the box represents Reeves's final attempt to communicate what he had discovered or was placed there by someone else remains unknown. The Blackwood case exists in that shadowy territory between documented history and frontier legend. The fragmentary evidence suggests an operation of remarkable depravity, a man who found a way to profit from the lawless nature of the territory by offering a service to criminal elements while simultaneously exploiting vulnerable travelers. The methodical nature of the enterprise, as suggested by the specialized structures and implements discovered during later excavations, points to something far beyond impulsive frontier violence. What makes the case particularly disturbing is the suggestion of institutional complicity. The territorial government's apparent reluctance to pursue a thorough investigation, even after federal officers were killed, raises troubling questions about priorities and possible corruption. The systematic removal or loss of evidence over subsequent decades suggests a continued desire to suppress the full story. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who conducted research on frontier violence patterns for the Smithsonian Institution in the 1980s, noted in an unpublished monograph, the Blackwood case represents a particular challenge to historical understanding, not merely because of fragmentary documentation, but because of what appears to be deliberate obscuration. Unlike many frontier atrocities which were either celebrated through sensationalist reporting or condemned through official channels, this case shows evidence of being intentionally erased from public consciousness. This pattern suggests the involvement of parties whose interests extended beyond the immediate crimes. The question of how many individuals may have disappeared at the Blackwood Ranch remains unanswerable. The fragmentary evidence suggests the operation continued for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Based on Thomas Reeves's observations of regular deliveries and processing, estimates range from as few as 15 to as many as 50 victims. The remains discovered in the riverbank collapse represented only 7 individuals, likely those disposed of most recently before discovery. The economic aspects of the operation, while rarely discussed in historical analyses, may provide the most logical explanation for both its existence and the apparent protection it received. In a frontier environment with minimal law enforcement, Blackwood appears to have identified a market opportunity: the disposal of problematic individuals for criminal organizations operating in the territory. The secondary use of pigs to eliminate evidence represents a grisly efficiency that minimized risk of discovery. Conway's ledgers suggest Blackwood received substantial payment for these services, far beyond what legitimate ranching operations in the area generated. Several entries note large deposits to territorial banks, often following visits from individuals described only as business associates. The wealth accumulated may explain the reluctance of local officials to investigate too thoroughly, particularly in a frontier economy where capital was scarce and influential. A curious historical parallel emerged in 1957 when a historian researching cattle baron migration patterns discovered references to an E. Blackwood purchasing substantial property in Wyoming Territory in 1873. The timing coincides with the disappearance of the Blackwood from Oklahoma records, and the purchaser was described as formerly of Missouri, the same origin listed in the original Oklahoma property records. Whether this represents the same individual operating under the same name after supposedly being transferred to a federal prison remains a tantalizing historical question. The Wyoming property records indicate the ranch operated until 1879, when ownership transferred following the proprietor's death from natural causes. No death certificate or newspaper obituary has been located. The property was sold to a cattle company based in Chicago, with no record of any family members claiming inheritance. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood case is how easily it disappeared from historical memory. Despite involving multiple murders, the disappearance of a U.S. Marshal, and a disposal method of singular brutality, the story generated no lasting public record, no cautionary tales in mainstream publications, no official acknowledgement beyond the most oblique references. This erasure speaks to the malleable nature of frontier history, where narrative often trumped documentation, and where powerful interests could shape the official record through selective preservation and strategic silence. What remains are only fragments: a water-damaged journal, scattered correspondence, archaeological anomalies, and bureaucratic discrepancies that hint at a horror too inconvenient for official recognition. In the spring of 1965, an elderly resident of Macabre, Oklahoma, gave an interview to a local newspaper for a feature on territorial memories. The man, identified as George Hawkins, claimed to have worked as a young assistant to the doctor who treated Blackwood's gunshot wound in 1871. Though most of his recollections focused on typical frontier medical practices, one passage stands out. The doctor never spoke much about that visit to the Blackwood place. Only told me once, when deep in his cups years later, that what he saw in the outbuildings there changed him. Said there are some things a Christian man shouldn't know exist in this world. Never would explain further, but he kept a loaded shotgun by his door from that day forward, and he'd never take a call out that way again, no matter the emergency. Hawkins concluded with an observation that perhaps best captures the legacy of the Blackwood case. Funny thing about the territory days, we remember the shootouts and the train robberies, put them in books and tell stories about them. But the worst things, the things that would turn your stomach inside out, those got buried deeper than any body. Maybe that's as it should be. Some evils don't deserve remembering. Yet in the scattered documents, the archaeological anomalies, the suspicious gaps in official records, and the persistent local legends, something of the Blackwood operation survives. A ghostly outline of a frontier atrocity, too methodical to be the work of simple madness, too profitable to be the result of mere sadism. It suggests instead a calculated exploitation of the territory's lawlessness, a business model built on the disposal of human beings with the complicity of multiple parties who found advantage in its operation and discretion in its concealment. The disappearance of Thomas Reeves, who came searching for a brother and found instead a horror beyond frontier imagination, serves as the human center of the fragmented narrative. His journal entries, abruptly ending before his final confrontation with Blackwood, represent perhaps the only honest account of what transpired along that isolated stretch of the Canadian River, a truth submerged beneath official silence, strategic document loss, and eventually the waters of progress. In 1961, shortly before his death, the elderly Jefferson Williams, who had provided the oral history account of the Blackwood operation, allegedly told his grandson a final detail that was not included in the official transcript. According to family lore, he claimed that in the weeks following the government takeover of the property, unusual activity continued at night. Local residents reported seeing wagons with military escorts moving to and from the abandoned ranch in darkness. When questioned, territorial officials claimed they were removing dangerous livestock from the property. Williams reportedly told his grandson they weren't just killing those pigs, they were burning everything, tearing down buildings, digging up the ground where the pens had been. It was like they wanted to remove any trace that the place had ever existed. Made you wonder what they'd found that was worse than what everyone already suspected. The waters of McGee Creek Reservoir now cover the former Blackwood Ranch. Occasional fishermen drift above what was once the main house, the outbuildings, the pig enclosures. Few, if any, know what may have occurred beneath their boats. The land keeps its secrets, as it has for generations. Those seeking definitive answers in the Blackwood case will be disappointed. Like many frontier incidents, it exists more in negative space, in what records don't say, in abrupt endings and curious silences, than in documented fact. What can be said with some certainty is that for a brief period, the territorial bend of the Canadian River may have concealed horrors more disturbing than any typical frontier violence. In 1968, an archaeologist involved in the reservoir planning published a journal article on historical preservation challenges in Oklahoma. A single paragraph referenced the Blackwood property. In some cases, the submersion of historical sites represents not only the loss of potential archaeological value, but perhaps also a form of cultural forgetting that might be viewed as psychologically convenient. Certain locations carry historical burdens that communities prefer not to confront directly. Water covers many sins. The article was later retracted due to what the publisher described as methodological concerns, though no specific issues were identified. The archaeologist accepted a position at a university in Canada shortly thereafter and published no further work on Oklahoma sites. The weathered stones of the unmarked section in the Fort Smith Cemetery reveal nothing about those who rest beneath them. Their stories, their names, their final moments, all lost to time and water and willing forgetting. In the case of Elias Blackwood and his hunger, perhaps the most terrifying aspect isn't what we know, it's what we don't. A final curious document emerged in 1966, discovered among territorial judicial records during cataloging for the state's semi-centennial. A single page, appearing to be part of a longer statement, contains what may be the only recorded words of Elias Blackwood himself. The document, identified as Partial Defendant Statement, Canadian River Investigation, contains no case number or official filing information. The fragmentary text reads, "Merely provided a service required by the territorial condition. Where law fails, alternative systems emerge. I created efficiency where there was waste." The disposal of human complications has always been necessary for civilization's advance. I merely industrialized the process. History will recognize my contribution to territorial development once sufficient time has passed for sentimental objections to fade. The frontier requires practical solutions to practical problems. The remainder of the statement, if it ever existed, has not been located in any archive. Like so much of the Blackwood case, it remains a fragment, a whisper, a shadow at the edge of documented history. The waters of McGee Creek Reservoir remain dark and deep. Fishermen occasionally report that certain areas produce no catch despite ideal conditions. Local guides avoid specific coves where they claim the water feels wrong. Occasional rumors of unusual sounds carrying across the surface on still nights are dismissed as imagination or wildlife. The land forgets nothing, though people might wish it would.